The JonBenét Ramsey case. The evidence no one talks about. There is a piece of evidence sitting in an American crime lab right now that has never been fully run through.
There's a case file sitting inside the Colorado Bureau of Investigation right now. Still active. Still being worked. Nearly 30 years after a 6-year-old girl was found dead in her own home. Most people think they already know this story. They picture pageant footage, tabloid covers, and a decades-old argument that never went anywhere. But that picture is outdated. Investigators are back inside this case in a way they haven't been in years, submitting old evidence for new testing, opening drawers of untested items from a basement crime scene, and following leads that didn't exist when this case first went cold. What you're about to hear isn't a rehash of the same tired theories. It's the actual sequence of decisions, mistakes, and reversals that turned a single terrible night in 1996 into one of the most misunderstood unsolved cases in American history. And it's a story that is, in a lot of ways, still being written right now. To understand why this case became what it became, you have to understand the town it happened in. Boulder, Colorado in December of 1996 was not a place that expected violence like this. It was a university town, affluent in certain neighborhoods, generally peaceful. The kind of city where a single homicide could shake the entire community for a year. The Ramsey family lived in one of those affluent neighborhoods, in a large house that would later become infamous in its own right. John Ramsey ran a technology company that had just gone public. His wife Patsy had competed in pageants in her youth and had survived a serious cancer diagnosis a few years earlier. They had an older son, and their youngest child, JonBenét, was 6 years old and in kindergarten. Like her mother, she had spent some of her early childhood in children's pageants, and the video footage from those pageants would go on to define how the public saw her for decades, which is one of the quieter tragedies buried inside this story. Long before anyone knew how she died, the public had already decided who she was based on stage makeup and costumes, rather than the ordinary 6-year-old who lived inside that image. The night before her death was unremarkable by every account. The family attended a Christmas gathering at a friend's house, came home late, and carried a tired child up to bed. They had an early flight booked for the next morning. Nothing about that evening suggested what was coming. Sometime in the hours that followed, in a house with 3 other people inside it, JonBenét was killed. And here is the detail that has haunted investigators from every side of this case for almost 30 years. There was no clear sign of forced entry. No broken window that couldn't be explained another way. No evidence of a struggle that woke anyone else in that house. Whatever happened without waking a household on a quiet residential street in a town that saw only a handful of homicides a year. That single unresolved fact is the reason this case has never settled into one clean narrative. Every theory that has ever been proposed, whether it points outward toward a stranger or inward toward the household, runs into that same wall eventually. Then there is the note, and the note is where this stops looking like an ordinary crime and starts looking almost impossible to categorize cleanly. It was discovered on a staircase the next morning, nearly 3 full pages, close to 400 words, written entirely by hand. It claimed that JonBenét was being held by a group demanding a ransom, gave specific instructions about not contacting the police, and threatened her life if those instructions weren't followed to the letter. On its face, that reads like a kidnapping, but almost nothing about how the note was produced matches how real ransom notes behave in real kidnapping cases. Genuine ransom notes tend to be short because the person writing them wants to get in, deliver the message, and leave as quickly as possible. This note did the opposite. It was long, it wandered, and parts of it read like someone drawing on the language of thriller novels rather than the language of an actual crime in progress. And both the notepad and the pen used to write it were traced back to items that were already inside the house. Nobody arrived carrying supplies. Someone sat down in a house where a child had just been killed and spent what investigators have estimated could have been anywhere from 20 minutes to nearly an hour composing a multi-page letter, using the homeowner's own paper, while risking discovery the entire time. That is an extraordinarily unusual choice for anyone trying to get away from a crime scene undetected. There's a second problem embedded in the note itself. It describes a ransom for a hostage, but the victim's body never left the house. Ransom notes exist to negotiate the return of someone who has actually been taken somewhere. And then there's the number. The note demanded a specific amount, not a round figure, not a sum scale to reflect the father's full net worth, but a strangely precise dollar amount. When investigators looked into where that number might have come from, they found it closely resembled a bonus the father had recently received from his company, information that was not public and would not have been easy for an outside stranger to know. So, from the very first piece of physical evidence recovered in this case, investigators were already being pulled in two directions at once. One direction pointed toward an intruder whose behavior didn't match how intruders actually behaved during a real kidnapping. The other pointed toward someone with detailed, personal knowledge of the household, writing under pressure in the hours after a child's death. Neither direction has ever been fully closed off, and that tension is the engine that has kept this case alive in public imagination for 3 decades. What happened over the following hours turned out to be almost as consequential as the crime itself, because police arrived responding to what looked like an active kidnapping, not a homicide, and that distinction shaped everything that came after. The house was never sealed as a murder scene, because as far as anyone knew in those early hours, no murder had happened there yet. The front door stayed open through the morning. Friends, a minister, and victim advocates were brought inside to comfort a family in crisis. People made coffee. People sat on furniture, opened doors, and moved through rooms, every one of them doing exactly what compassionate people instinctively do in the worst hour of someone else's life, and every one of them, without meaning to, quietly compromising evidence that a homicide investigation would eventually need untouched. Understaffing made the situation worse. Boulder's police department simply wasn't built to run a fast-moving, high-profile homicide investigation the moment it began, because departments in towns like that rarely need to. For a critical stretch of that first morning, essentially one detective was managing an entire scene alone, trying to support a family in crisis, coordinate a department still expecting a ransom phone call, and somehow also preserve a crime scene that was rapidly filling with well-meaning visitors. For a while, investigators had reason to believe the note might be genuine, because it promised a phone call and instructions for a ransom drop sometime between 8 and 10 that morning. So they waited. They rigged the phone line to trace an incoming call, and the house held its breath through that window. The call never came, and when that window closed in silence, the story the note had constructed began to fall apart in real time, because a kidnapper who never calls to collect a ransom isn't behaving like a kidnapper at all. By early afternoon, the investigation was stuck in a strange kind of limbo. It wasn't confirmed as anything except a missing child case built around a note that was looking less and less credible by the hour. It was inside that vacuum that a decision was made which has been debated for decades. The lead detective on scene asked a father and a family friend to search the house themselves, room by room, for anything unusual. It's worth stating plainly what that decision actually was. Asking people who had not yet been ruled out as anything to search the very rooms that might contain evidence, without a trained investigator present to observe or document what was found. In a fully staffed, textbook homicide investigation, that doesn't happen. But this wasn't a textbook investigation. It was one overwhelmed department, in a house that had already been compromised for hours, trying to make a decision under conditions nobody there had been trained to handle. That search ended in a small, windowless room in the basement that most people in that house had probably passed 100 times without a second thought. JonBenét's body was there. What happened in the minutes after that discovery is, forensically speaking, one of the most damaging sequences in the entire case. Not because of any malice, but because of the rawest, most human reaction imaginable. The scene was disturbed. The body was moved and carried upstairs before it could be examined and documented exactly as it had been found. And once that happens, there is no undoing it. No photograph, no expert reconstruction, and no amount of later forensic analysis can put a crime scene back the way it existed before someone touched it. By the end of that first day, the two things a homicide investigation depends on most, an untouched scene and an undisturbed body, were both already gone, not erased by a killer covering tracks, but worn away by the accumulated weight of shock, grief, and instinct. What the autopsy eventually revealed only deepened the case's central, unresolved question. JonBenét had suffered a severe skull fracture, one that forensic experts testified would have been significant enough to cause instant unconsciousness. She had also been strangled with a cord that was tied to a broken handle from a paintbrush found among the household's own art supplies. 2 injuries, either one potentially fatal on its own, and investigators have spent close to 3 decades unable to agree on which came first, because the order changes the fundamental nature of the crime. If the head injury happened first, whether by accident or in a sudden burst of violence, then the strangulation that followed could be read as an attempt to disguise what had already occurred. If the strangulation was the intended method from the very beginning, that points toward something more deliberate and calculated. Experts have argued this point for years without resolution, and you cannot close a case when the forensic community itself can't agree on what kind of crime actually took place. For a long stretch of the investigation, statistics pointed inward, the way they often do in cases where a child dies inside a home with no clear evidence of forced entry. Because tragically, that is where investigators most often have to start looking first. One of the original lead detectives on the case became convinced enough of that direction that he eventually resigned from the investigation and later argued publicly for it. But lab work complicated that picture considerably. DNA recovered from JonBenét's clothing, later confirmed using newer testing methods at more than one location, belonged to an unidentified male. It didn't match her father, her mother, her brother, or any of the family friends who were tested over the years. To this day, that profile has never been definitively matched to a known individual. To people who believe an intruder was responsible for this crime, that unmatched male DNA is the single strongest piece of physical evidence in the entire case, a genetic signature belonging to someone who has never been identified, sitting inside national databases for decades. To skeptics, it's potentially explainable by contamination introduced at some point before the clothing was ever tested. That one disagreement, more than any other single piece of evidence, is why this case has never been able to move from open speculation into a resolved conclusion. This is roughly the point where the story stops being only about a crime and starts being about a system, because in 2006, a man living overseas confessed to the murder, and for a handful of frantic days, headlines around the world declared the case solved. Within days, his DNA was tested and it didn't match, and it became clear that the detailed knowledge he claimed to have was pulled from years of publicly available reporting rather than first-hand involvement. He was cleared. That false alarm actually demonstrated something important about where the investigation stood technologically at the time. The DNA testing available then was good enough to rule someone out almost immediately. It simply hadn't been used in any systematic way to actively rule someone in. Which brings us to the part of this story that tends to get lost underneath the pageant photography and the note theories. The technology to potentially move this case forward in a meaningful way has existed for years. It's called forensic genetic genealogy, and it works by taking a DNA profile recovered from a crime scene and comparing it against public genealogy databases, then building outward through family trees until it narrows down to a specific person. That is the exact method that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018, decades after his crimes were committed, and it has since been credited with helping resolve several hundred other cold cases across the United States. For much of the time since that method became available, the unidentified male DNA profile connected to this case sat inside a federal system without being systematically run through that same genealogical process. Officials have cited a range of legitimate procedural reasons over the years, including sample degradation, chain of custody requirements, and the logistics of coordinating across multiple agencies, including the FBI. Those aren't necessarily illegitimate concerns. But while other families across the country were receiving phone calls that their own decades-old cases had finally moved forward because of this exact technology, this particular case largely didn't. Year after year, even as the tools kept improving in the background. Even the grand jury process reflects this same pattern of an investigation that seemed to stall rather than reach resolution. In 1999, a Colorado grand jury reviewed the evidence in this case for months, and the public was told afterward that there simply wasn't enough evidence to bring charges against anyone. It turned out that wasn't the complete picture. In 2013, after a journalist successfully sued to have the grand jury's records unsealed, it became public that the jurors had actually voted in favor of indictment, not for murder, but for lesser charges connected to child abuse resulting in death. The district attorney at the time chose not to move that indictment forward, and the full reasoning behind that decision has never been completely explained to the public. For 14 years, most people believed no one on that jury had found enough evidence to act on. The truth, once it came out, was considerably more complicated. Public attention on the case surged again in 2024 after a new documentary reignited interest, and the surviving family renewed public calls for updated forensic testing. And this is where the story becomes current rather than historical, because Boulder investigators have not let this case sit still since then. Over the past year, the Boulder Police Department has confirmed it is actively pursuing new interviews, re-interviewing individuals based on fresh tips, and submitting both old and previously untested evidence for advanced DNA analysis at the state crime lab, working alongside federal partners. Boulder's police chief has publicly stated that this case remains a top departmental priority, pointing out that DNA testing technology continues to evolve in ways that could finally clarify evidence that was ambiguous decades ago. JonBenét's father has continued to push publicly for independent